Welcome, friends. Welcome back if you are joining us again, or if you're here for the first time, thank you so much for joining us. This is Going Deeper. It's our Q&A series where we get to sit down with some of our pastors and our staff here at Mount Rainier Christian Center and get to dive a little bit more into the content of the sermons we hear on Sunday mornings. You know, on a Sunday, we don't really get the chance to ask questions, or there might be some things we want to follow up on. This is a place where we get to do that. So right now we have Pastor Greg with us. Thank you for joining us, Greg, and we're going to be talking about the sermon Visible, part of our In His Grip series where we're discussing the gospel. We're really getting into the nuts and bolts of what the gospel means and what it is to us. In Visible, we are going to learn a little bit more about what it looks like to have faith, right? So the first question that we start off with, early in the sermon, we learn that faith is personal, right? And it comes from our understanding and trusting who God is. The more we understand Him and learn to trust Him, the stronger our faith can grow. You know? Does that mean that someone who's a new believer can't practice faith well? Or do we need to attain a certain level of relationship with God before we can really be faithful?
Great question, Brent. It actually means the opposite, right? Okay. So in the first week that we were together, we learned that, the gospel is given to us in the context of a promise, not a deal. A deal, both sides hold up their end. In a promise, God promises to hold up His end. We simply believe in it, right? So as we then receive that gospel, each of us responds uniquely. There's similarities. We're all human beings, right? But we all have different backgrounds, different cultural traditions, different families, different gifts and talents and so on. And whatever response that we have to God may be totally different than yours, but our gratitude for what God has done comes from a million different places. I've had friends who are musicians, and when they are full of thanksgiving, they want to write a song. I don't want to write a song, right? Yeah. When I'm full of thanksgiving, I want to praise somebody. I want to speak to them, and then that's my way of giving thanks. When my wife wants to give thanks, she gives attention and she gives gifts and she serves. You know what I mean? So all responses, whether we're new believers or been believers for a lifetime, all of those responses are precious to God, and it's their uniqueness that delights Him most, because He made us unique. So.
And so, none of those responses are really better or worse. No. We can be confident in the fact that whatever we naturally feel inclined to respond out of our gratefulness is going to be delightful to
Yeah, it is. When you have more than one child, they respond to you, with some similarities, but they're also unique and different. And as a parent, you delight in that. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on, we get to hear about how faith isn't an invisible thing, right? But is evidenced by how we act. It's very visible.
Yeah.
We believe by doing, right?
Yeah.
So if someone was to do sort of like a faith assessment of their life to see kind of how they were doing in that aspect of, of their walk with Christ, what should they look for to know if they're really living out their faith or if they're kind of missing there?
It's a great question. And the answer is, are you giving back to God something you truly love to give back to God? It's not as if He has a set of kind of arbitrary expectations, like maybe a supervisor at work or a coach on a team or even a teacher in a classroom. No. He delights in you giving Him your heart. If I could tell a quick story, I'm a little old, so when the whole tattoos thing came along, and my son's part of that generation, I was nervous. What's he going to do? What's it going to look like? And so he said to me when he got to be 18 and he had that freedom, he said, "Dad, I'm going to get my first tattoo." And I said, okay, because he's an adult now. And so I lived for the next few months in fear of what that would be. Well, long story short, he came and showed it to me after he got it. And the backstory was that when he was a child growing up, we'd go camping, and when we go to bed at night in the tent, I would tell him stories about a guy named Max the Knight. Max the Knight was a knight who had adventures, and had red armor and a yellow helmet and a blue horse. He was a kid's knight, right? And he would have all these adventures. Well, the tattoo my son got on his shoulder is Max the Knight. I wept, right? I'm like, are you kidding, right? Now, awesome. That doesn't mean you should get a Max the Knight tattoo, right? And it wouldn't mean anything if you did. But because he gave that to me. So the test is what you're seeking to give back to God something that's precious to you, something that you delight in, something that you love, right? For me, the gift I hope that I can give back to God, one of them anyway, is the gift of teaching, because I love learning, right? So if I'm giving that, I'm giving something that's genuine. So again, yeah, what you said is spot on.
So it's not that we want, I think we have a tendency to think that whatever has the highest value as far as we're concerned is what we should be giving back to God. That's what he wants, whatever is the most valuable. But it's whatever comes really from the heart the most, because that is what's most valuable.
That's what's most, because he's a father, right? So yeah, that's exactly the idea.
Absolutely. Great stuff. We're moving on here. So our faith, right, is rooted in our understanding of God, in our trust in him, and our relationship with him. But I think I speak for many of us, or maybe all of us at different times, that it can be hard learning to trust God instead of trusting our instincts or ourselves, right? So how can we practice building trust in God? Maybe if we're just starting out, how can we practice building that?
Yeah, well, so as we begin to listen to Jesus, inevitably the Holy Spirit is going to challenge us about something. So, Jesus talks about the way we use our tongue, the way we talk. And then inside of us, in our hearts, the Holy Spirit's going to say, yeah, the way you spoke to your wife wasn't good or right. And if you speak to her differently, in a way that honors me and reflects what I'm saying, God says you're going to experience a blessing as a result of that. And each time we respond to what God is saying to us, and then we live that out, what we experience is the thing that grows our faith, right? And so then it goes round and round and round like that. And his challenges will get deeper and bigger, because his desire is to teach us faith. And, it's kind of like when we were teaching our son to swim, you go further and further away from the side of the pool, and he learns more and more and more, and how to go farther. So it's the same thing, we grow by doing what he says, and then that teaches us to trust the next thing, because the reward and so on.
A little counterintuitive to how we want to experience things nowadays, because I feel like in our culture it's, you can become an expert on a lot of things quickly, and you want to say, well, I want to be able to swim all the way across the pool, within the first week. But it's okay to start small, and that's how it should be.
That is how it should be. And see, here's the difference. The things that's easy to become experts in aren't growing up. You can't speed up growing up. I mean, you can help yourself mature, but your body's got to develop, your mind's got to develop. You can't hurry that, right? And so in the same way as we grow up in our relationship with God and in the Spirit, that takes time. Best example I can give is, my wife and I are about to celebrate our 40th anniversary. Now, we loved each other when we got married, and we loved each other in year 5 and year 10 and year 15. But compared to now, would I trade our love when we were first married for our love at 40 years? Not in a million years, right? So it's the same in our relationship with God. The longer we walk with him,
Absolutely. Okay, so this next one, I think this has to do and ties in with our faith and our belief, even though this wasn't really covered in the message that we heard. But on the subject of the importance of our belief or our faith, Matthew chapter 22 says, if you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. Is the meaning of this verse as straightforward as it seems? Because I feel like, that's one of those verses that maybe, it's like, that sounds too good to be true, right? What's the fine print there? Is it that straightforward?
Well, again, everything that God says has a context, right? So when he says that, it's in the context of everything else he said, right? So the Bible is going to tell us, for example, also in 1 John 5:14, that this is the confidence we have in asking God, that if we ask anything according to his will, it'll be given to us. So we must understand that when we go to God to ask for whatever, it's his heart to satisfy us, but he knows best what will satisfy us, and he knows best what's good for us. I like Calvin and Hobbes, and one of my favorite Calvin and Hobbes cartoons. Calvin's, what is he, 7, 8 years old, and he goes out to the garage and he says, "Dad, it's my birthday. Can I have a flamethrower?" Right? And Dad goes, "No, you're not getting a flamethrower." And I love Calvin's response. He says, "Well, I promise not to use it in the house." So somehow our asking, most of the time, our asking is like that. And so what Jesus is saying is that God's desire is to satisfy, to meet your needs on every level, but most deeply on the deepest levels. And so he answers with a father's heart, So we may ask for a flamethrower, but he knows that what we really want is more than that. And so he responds in that way. And, the other side of that is that we want everything on our timetable, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the day is coming, the Bible says, when all our prayers are answered, all our desires are satisfied. May not be when we want them to be, but they will be satisfied. So, yeah.
So wrapping up with this thought, related to trusting in God, I'm sure many of us have felt this way at some point, but what about when someone has had such a difficult life or such devastating circumstances that from their perspective, it seems like there's no evidence that God cares at all about them or their situation?
Yeah.
How can someone like that learn to trust God?
Yeah, well, that's going to be hard, right? But it's the same process. We begin to believe what he says. We begin to understand that, God presents himself to us not through somebody who's invulnerable to suffering, but who's somebody who suffers deeply. Jesus is rejected, unjustly accused, mistreated, slandered, and then ultimately physically abused, and executed for crimes he didn't commit. We can go on and on. So God doesn't say to us that the evidence of faith is that we're not hurt. What he says to us is that what he does and will do in the world transcends all that. He says he's going to wipe away all the tears in the end. So, we begin to believe that instead of the idea that there will be no tears. And that's how we grow in our faith. I have so many friends who've been through deep water. Just talking with a woman today who both of her children were born with significant birth defects and passed away before they were 20, and yet she's sitting here telling me about how good God is, Yeah. So for every person who says, I don't believe in God because I've seen tough stuff, I know lots of people who say, through that, God revealed himself to me more deeply than I could have imagined. So the road to faith is the same. We listen to who he tells us he is. We watch who he says he is. We watch what he's offered to us, what he promised to us, what he's revealed to us. And through those things, that faith grows. But, really the point of the message is that when God gives us his grace, there must be some response. If we don't respond at all, we haven't really received the gift. If my wife does something for me and I just ignore it, right? That's not faith, right? So the challenge for believers is that we worry if we have enough works. And this is the big idea in the message. We worry that whether or not we have enough works or whether we have the right works. But see, the mistake is that centers the question in me. God isn't concerned with how many works, or even if we have the right ones by somebody else's estimation. He says, no, if you respond to me in your way at all, those are works. And for example, we told the story about the woman with the alabaster jar of perfume, right? Yep. So she comes and gives, she was probably a perfume merchant, or maybe she was an inheritor of a estate that had a lot, but she chooses to take this expensive gift and give it to Jesus. Well, the crowd says, what a waste. She could have done better. But the beauty of the story, they say she could have sold it. It's a year's wages, given the money to the poor. That would have been better. Jesus says, no, she did this personally for me. And because of that, this is wonderful and precious. This is her love for me. In the same way, God looks at my works. He doesn't say, are they better than Brent's? Are they the same as Brent's? He says, is this Greg giving me his heart? The things that he loves, the things that, are dear to him. That's works, right? That's why one person can live their works out one way and another way, another way. God delights in our uniqueness. So it's not the amount of works, any works at all, that come from our heart, that are given to God. So, yeah.
So, I mean, just to kind of wrap us up, something I just thought about, like, I'm a big watch guy. I enjoy watches. But it seems counterintuitive to me. I would be too worried about what people would say. Like, if I were to meet Jesus, I wouldn't, I'd want to give him like a really beautiful watch. I think that'd be really cool. But like people would think that's dumb. But you're saying God might delight in that.
Oh,
right?
Man, right?
You think he'd be into that?
If that's really your passion, absolutely, right?
Yeah.
He thrills to that. And, when we discover that, faith and works looks different. Sure, there's going to be common things. God delights in gifts that are other-centered.
Yeah.
I find out that my son at his work, a couple of ladies came to me some time ago and told me the story about how he served them at work. Of course I love that, right? But that tattoo on his shoulder,
yeah.
Oh my goodness, right? Yeah. So if we give back to God those things that are dear to us, man, yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, to close out the show as we do, if you could leave folks with one short encouragement or reminder to focus on from this sermon, what would you say?
Yeah. Don't worry that your works are enough. Give to God your gratitude, your thanks, your appreciation for what he's done for you in whatever ways your heart conceives, right? Certainly that's going to be guided by broad scriptural boundaries, but the broad scriptural boundaries aren't the thing that please God the most. We can obey God with an unwilling heart, and he says that's okay, but right? But when we give him our heart, out of our love, those are the works, and trust yourself in this, right? One person wants to serve kids, one person wants to serve teenagers, one person wants to serve seniors. None of those is better than the others, Give what is near and dear to your heart as a gift to God in love. That's works.
Absolutely. Well, that's all for this episode, folks. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.